Free this afternoon at 3 o'clock in conversation with Michael Gove and at 6 o'clock in conversation with Tom Tugendhat. So clearly the organisers didn't know the guests they were booking when they booked this room. But it's always a nightmare of party conferences. When you book a fringe meeting, you either book a room that's far too large or far too small. But there we are. Ben, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
I mean, you must be, I guess, one of the busiest people in the country, or you have been over the last 7 or 8 months. I was looking back on my phone, and we had a text exchange back in January. We said, "Oh yeah, let's meet for lunch soon," and of course, a few weeks after that, I just thought, well, there's no point in following up on that, given what happened in Ukraine. Just take us through an average day for you at the moment.
I'm usually in the office about 7:15, and I will probably, if I'm in the UK. I'll do about till probably 9 at night, something like that. I've done 30 international visits this year. I was in Ukraine last week. I'm off to Poland on Tuesday for the day. And I was woken at 4 in the morning. Well, about 3 nights in a row recently. So yeah, it's a full-on job, and I think if you couple that with trying to reform defence. And leadership contests and all of that, it's pretty busy. But you know, I wouldn't want it any other way. The MOD is a big old oil tanker, and if you really want to reform anything in government, you have to push your changes to the fingertips of these organisations. They are deeply resistant to change. You often hear the sort of throwaway line about civil servants. It's not really about civil servants. It's often about knowing the detail, sometimes triangulating across government and making sure you deliver it and keep on delivering. So, I think it's full. But, you know, we've had COVID, op pitting for Afghanistan, obviously the invasion of Ukraine, sadly, obviously the death of Her Majesty the Queen. It just doesn't really stop.
And how much of your time is spent on Ukraine?
Probably just under half. It depends. I mean, out of hours it might be a lot of time because of operations and incidents that happen. Obviously, the latest being the gas pipeline in. There's a gas pipeline, obviously, where we saw in Denmark, the Nord Stream in the international waters there. I'll be convening with the Dutch a virtual joint expeditionary force meeting on Monday, so I have to break my timetable tomorrow to meet with 10 of the Nordic states about what are we going to do about it, because the Nordic states and ourselves are deeply vulnerable to people doing things on our cables and our pipelines. So suddenly that becomes an issue we have to get to the bottom of, and we have to think about what assets we can move to give people reassurance or indeed investigate what's going on.
International cooperation, I think, on this has been really interesting to observe, because I think a lot of people in this country tend to think that the whole world is against Russia, but the truth is it isn't. And you've got countries like India, for example, I was going to say sitting on the fence, but I'm not even sure that they're doing that. And yet in Europe, there has been a degree of unity, which, I mean, I'm quite surprised by. Has it surprised you?
Yeah, I think it hasn't surprised me as much as it's clearly surprised President Putin. You know, I think, whether he wants to believe it is a different issue. I mean, I think the day after the invasion, I held a donor conference there and then for military aid. And I think we had about 27 people attending, 27 countries. I think that has grown into 39 now, countries including Qatar, as opposed to Kuwait, have attended, countries as far as afield. And actually non-traditional, sort of very neutral countries. Ireland have been in attendance at most of these donor conferences. And, you know, Ireland historically was very, very strong on its neutrality and recognises that assisting in Ukraine is not, it's not about aggression or anything. It is fundamentally about upholding human rights and the international rule of law. And by having a big group of donors, you can allow every country to play to its strengths. And it doesn't have to be lethal military aid. It can be humanitarian aid. It can be others. So it's been pretty impressive, and it's not stopped for a bit. You know, I mean, there will be a narrative out there with, the West will get tired. Well, the actions are opposite of that. And what we're now seeing is, you know, a new dollop of not only donations from the United States, but from other countries. You know, The Danish jointly convened with us in August a conference on an international fund, and then indeed in the training that we're now delivering both in the UK and in Europe, it's very international.
Do you think sometimes, though, the language which one or two countries have used hasn't quite matched what they've delivered? I mean, I won't mention any countries in particular, but Germany, for example, just to pick one out of the air.
I thought you were going to put an accent on there. No, look, I think, to be fair, Germany's been treated fairly in this. You have to understand that each country has its own political systems. It's not as straightforward in a number of political systems that you can just, as a minister, unilaterally make decisions. The German system, for its own understandable constitutional reasons, has a very high dependency on getting things passed through the Bundestag. And so even when the Germans have the intent to provide equipment, the bureaucratic hurdles make it slower. But, you know, everyone gets there in the end, I think, is how I would put it. And that goes to that strength of an alliance like NATO, that you can move at different speeds. You know, Germany has been one of the only 3 countries that have put in place the GMRS, the 270s, the M270 systems that are launching these missiles that you will hear HIMARS. HIMARS is effectively the wheeled version of the tracked version. The tracked version is the British and the Germans. We've put those in. The Germans have put those in. You know, those are very potent weapons that are actually damaging Russia significantly. Well, that's Germany. You know, Germany and Britain. It takes a bit of time, but they have actually delivered. They are cautious about some things they provide, but you know, I just think they've been slightly had a rough deal in it because there's a lot of other people have come forward and delivered, and we've managed to continue that pipeline of defence.
I suppose it just comes to something when the Greens out-hawk the other parties. In terms of what we and others are providing, obviously the war's been going on now, what is it, 7 or 8 months. There comes a time, I guess, when you run out of things to provide. Are we at that point yet?
We're certainly, all of us, first of all, have discovered our own vulnerabilities. You know, that if you are in a prolonged war with complex weapon systems, you need to have a ready supply chain or good stocks. And one of my sort of battles for years has been that, you know, defence over the last probably 3 or 4 decades has been hollowed out. So when ministers needed to make savings or it needed to spend more on a new shiny platform, they often took it away from the sort of unsexy parts of defence. For lots of reasons. Some of it glamour, you know, you can't stand in front of a dry dock and say, you know, this is a great press release and would you like to come and have a look at my crane? But they are the things that make defence function. They are the things that give us availability. These are the things that allow us to run our equipment longer at a cheaper amount. If I'm constantly fixing things, it actually costs a lot more money, or if you're extending the life of equipment. So that was been going on for decades, and it's not unique to the United Kingdom. And as ammunition stocks are another part of those areas. They're classified. I don't publish how many types of weapons I have in what levels. So they clearly have been taking a hit right across the board. And so Ukraine has reminded us that, you know, these things come home to haunt you. It's reminded the Russians. I mean, if you can see, they're firing off complex weapons that take months to make, if not years, and need supply chains. And of course, the Russian supply chain is dependent, rather foolishly, partly on Ukraine. So they've actually bombed one of their main suppliers for rocket engines. Strategic genius that President Putin is clearly proving to be. And also some of the Europeans who were supplying them with equipment. And the same goes for us. Some of our weapon stockpiles are fairly low, and the supply chain switched off 10 years ago. So we have to reinvigorate that. It's a lesson across, really the world will be seeing this, the United States the same. But we've recognized, we've got ahead of that challenge on Ukraine, which is why we've set up 2 things. An international fund, which I think we've raised over €500 million, or close to €500 million, of donations for military aid, and the bids are in at the moment. And that's, I'm joined by people like Norway and Denmark who have donated to that fund. And there are some other countries that we hope to get on board. We've put in £250 million. And that is to allow us to place orders in factories for next year hopefully, I mean, we're waiting for the bids, to start production lines going again for things like shells and 152mm, which are Soviet-era shells. There are production lines around Europe that we need to start placing orders in. So as we migrate from effectively gifting in kind, I felt there were two other areas to work on. One was starting to indicate to industry we're going to place orders for ourselves as well, because we need to replace what we've given away, and then also training, because we can provide both hardware and software effectively to the Ukrainians, and that's why we're training 10,000 at least Ukrainians in the UK in sort of basic training, but also special to arms training. And we're coordinating that through the same centre that we use for military aid, the International Donors Coordination Centre, the IDCC, which again is very heavily British led, but we've got everyone there from Canadians to the United States. It's all based in Europe, and it's managing to coordinate everything.
How do the finances of this work? Because you've mentioned the word donor several times. But of course, in the Second World War, we didn't get weapons and supplies donated from America. In the end, we had to pay for them. Is there a similar thing here where you say, well, yeah, we're delighted to donate, give you all of this weaponry, but we will want it repaid 10, 20, 30 years down the line?
I mean, I think there is two tracks to this. Ukraine is out purchasing equipment for itself, and indeed has contracted to buy from us 2 minesweepers that are pretty much ready to go, Sandown class minesweepers, and we've been training their forces in Portsmouth how to use that, and they've been buying many other pieces of equipment from around Europe. But at the same time, yes, we've made donations. We've made donations out of our own stock. Some of that is fairly straightforward because stock has a life time limit on it, and so some of the munitions we've given we're probably going to come out of service in the next year or two, and actually it's quite important that it's not a big ask to donate. So, for example, we donated Batch 1 Brimstone missiles, which have a range of between 6 to 12 kilometres, depends how it's delivered. Very, very clever pieces of equipment. The Russians don't like them because they make a sort of whizzing noise as they head directly at them. So it's a bit like the Stuka. I think when they hear that noise, they all run. And they were basically out of date. I mean, not out of date, but they've been replaced by the Batch 2 and the Batch 3 Brimstone. So giving those away, gifting them is fairly simple. And then, yeah, we've done some juggling. So the M270s, those sort of our version of the tracked HIMARS, what actually happened was we had some ready to be modified ourselves. We gifted those to the Ukrainians because the Norwegians kindly gifted theirs to us or transferred theirs to us, or I think actually we'll probably end up buying them, but we were happy to delay our refurbishment of it. So there's a lot of juggling goes on. If I fall under the political bus as Defence Secretary, I've got a pretty good career as either an arms smuggler or a trader. I mean, I have been involved in purchasing or acquiring armaments for Ukraine across the globe. And the one thing that is nice, and there are a number of countries who want to help and do help secretly. We don't make it public, they don't want to know in public, but Russia would be deeply unhappy to learn that some of its people they would try and like or think they could rely on deeply disapprove what's going on, and I think that's a real credit to many of those countries.
In terms of non-military supplies, someone phoned in my radio show the other day, and they'd just come back from Ukraine having taken a lorry load of body armour there. And I thought to myself, well, isn't that sort of thing that we should be providing, or we in the international community should be providing anyway, rather than leaving it to private individuals to do?
Well, the reason we set up this thing with the IDCC is that early on, because everyone, the galvanising of this support across the political divide, across the generational divide, both in the UK and in Europe, has meant that everyone wants to do their bit. People want to contribute. So early on in this stage, we had everyone getting in touch. We had MPs saying, oh, I've got a friend who's an MP in Ukraine, and you'd get it third and fourth hand, and it would go round in circles, and the Ukrainian embassy was doing a brilliant job in lobbying, and so they'd put in a list. We would have pretty direct communications between the Ukrainian, my counterpart and the general staff, so I pretty much knew what they wanted at the time they wanted it. So we thought it was important to effectively consolidate into a authoritative list, and that's what the IDCC does. It effectively is the holder of the list. But there are a lot of other people still want to contribute, and there's always, there's never a shortage of things like, there's never enough body armor or helmets and things medicines and things. So people have been able to want to deliver on that. They like the ability to crowdfund, but we've sent over tens of thousands of body armor and helmets, and everybody else has in Europe. We're now on to winter clothing. I think we've supplied 300,000 pieces of winter clothing as an international community, and I'm looking right now for an extra 100,000. So if anyone's got any 100,000 of winter clothing for the Ukrainians, I'll be happy to put it in a truck, but I'll ask my Nordic colleagues on Monday if they've got any more, because of course they're going to be the leaders in it. So I think it's brilliant. People want to do it. I think it's all managed, and it is for the Ukrainians, it's almost total war. So it's not like it won't be used. And the key here is to make sure that every soldier that we train leaves this country ready for the next stage. And when I started on the training, they would come off the plane literally in tracksuits, these guys. We'd train them for 3 weeks. They'd have lots of uniform, and then we'd take it off them, and they'd have to go back. Now we're at a stage where they get issued 55 pieces of equipment, which they all take with them, and they are delivered as sort of, ready for their next stage of specialist training, all equipped and all armed. And we used to train them on a few AK-47s, but we didn't have many. So we'd have to switch them to our SA-80s, which would take a few days, which is 3 days. So I went out and found a few thousand AK-47s, one of my new career options. And it was quite odd. Some old friends from Sandhurst would say, "Oh, I've got a few of these." And I'd say, "Oh." So, but now they're all trained on AK-47, 74. So I do a nice line. And, well, I know.
You obviously were in the military. I mean, not many defence secretaries have any real hands-on experience of a military career beforehand. How has that helped you in this particular war? Because presumably you have a greater understanding of the weaponry, the procedures, than some of your predecessors might have had.
To some extent. I mean, I know what it's like to be in a hollowed-out army. I was in North Germany in an armoured infantry battalion where, half the kit, a percentage of the vehicles never worked. There was no really any ammunition stocks. The variants of the vehicles we all promised never appeared. I know what it's like, and it's why I'm quite passionate when I argue against what I call top trump people who just want to have numbers but don't want to have properly protected vehicles, or they just want to be able to boast we've got X number of frigates when half of them aren't working. We have 6 Type 45 frigates, brilliant frigates. They cost about £1 billion each. Most of the time they spent tied up against the side because the gas turbines didn't work properly, and it turns out we don't have the crews anyhow to have them. So what's the point in boasting your numbers when you're not creating perfectly formed units or perfectly resourced individuals? So that gives me an advantage. I also know the sort of military gobbledygook that officers love to embark on. I mean, the MOD has a sort of disease. It cannot help but abbreviate things immediately. I mean, immediately. I mean, if we decided to contract to Onward for something, you would be immediately down to ONW. They just can't help but immediately cut everything down. So when you get that deployed against you, you sort of know what they're talking about. Although I often test them by saying, "What does that mean?" And you discover they don't really know what it means either. So, but actually, the most useful experience as Defence Secretary has been that I've done every rank in government. I mean, experience matters in governing. I mean, I think it's a really underplayed. We all fall in love with, or the media always fall in love with, the bright young thing, or the new super duper fast promotion minister. But actually, the system will eat them alive, and usually does. The reality is, you learn your trade in government, and if you know how to govern.
That back to Tom Tugendhat a bit later, maybe.
We'll see. I mean,
because you did the job that he's.
I did the job he did. Yeah, that was my Minister of State job. Yeah. One of the best jobs in government. But I think it's important that we value experience in governing, because that is actually how you deliver what you want.
But in terms of getting your own way in the MOD, when you're in these meetings with all the generals and the top civil servants, does that help you, sort of having had that background? And also, when you go out and meet the ranks, they think, well, he was one of us once.
Yeah, they probably call me a tosser then. I don't know. I think what I would say is, look, I mean, I think the thing is, I'm lucky that also generationally, people of my generation who are still serving are the generals. I didn't know anything about the Navy or Air Force. I mean, even if in your first 10 years or 8, 9 years, what I did, and you don't really see much. The Air Force make you wait at You turn up at 4 in the morning for a flight at 10, the usual thing. Cancel at last minute and just stick you in the back of a hold so you don't move. It's never changed. It's never changed. It's got better, honestly. You didn't. I don't think I ever saw the Navy. So in a sense, it's not. A lot of it's as new as it would be to you. I think the key thing is, you're not going to be intimidated by rank. I think that's the key thing, and the uniforms. But ultimately, they are pretty good. I mean, they understand the difference between the sort of elected authority of the state and their role in it. And their job is to give me the best military advice, and they do. And I think the challenge sometimes is moving at a pace I want, which I think is no different in any department. But again, I think not only is it important to have the experience of how to govern, it's also important to be in a job long enough. Now, that's easier said than done because prime ministers always need patronage. They like, reshuffles are, they keep some of our correspondents busy. What would happen if some of the political lobby couldn't speculate on a reshuffle every 6 months? I mean, it's a whole industry. But ultimately, the longer the longer you're in it, the longer you get to make effect as well. When you start outliving your directors and you start appointing your senior people in a department, you start to shape the department, and that doesn't happen if you change every 18 months.
And do you think that, given so much of your time is spent on Ukraine, that there are things that you would have liked to have done, but frankly, there's not enough bandwidth?
No, I'm still, that's why I go even longer at night and work later. We've got head office reform we're going to announce. The Department of State desperately needed reform to be threat focused and able to respond and deliver to the modern types of threat. We have to learn how to be campaigners in the same way political campaigners are. You and I have been conservatives on and off. It's a long old campaign. It's a lifetime of fight. It's not an easy time now. You don't see off the likes of Russia in a nice little neat campaign. It's an enduring challenge against an acute threat like Russia, and we need to be thinking about it all the time and globally and how we're going to counter it. So we're in the middle, you'll see very soon, the details of a head office reform, and that's quite a deep set of reforms I'm determined to do. We're also obviously growing our knowledge in the Pacific and understanding. Some of it we have to re-engage. We also are in Africa, we're watching with great concern what's going on in the west of Africa, but part of that is Wagner. And then obviously we should never forget our friends in the Middle East. It's incredibly important what we see there. And so one of our designs for the future force is to make sure it is genuinely deployable, adaptable, and plays to our strengths. And that's another issue about which is really important, is what is Britain good at in its defence? And what should we be focusing on for the next fight, the future fight? What are we learning in Ukraine right now? And that's really exciting to do. It happens to be coming out of Ukraine, but those sort of things have shown what we can do really well. And some of them I can't talk about, but nevertheless, it's going to be a great influence on our future.
Why do you think so much of the defence establishment, the defence commentators, got Putin so wrong? I can remember back in November last year, I was convinced that he would invade Ukraine at some point, and everyone I interviewed said, no, you're completely wrong. He won't do that. He wouldn't be so stupid. I don't know.
But you were also accused, if you did, like you and me, you were also accused of being reckless.
Yeah, exactly.
Or
warmonger.
or provocative.
Yeah.
I remember last August wanting to go to the 30th anniversary of the establishment of Ukraine in post-1991. And the Foreign Office advice was if I went, I might be provocative. I went. I didn't go. We had op-pitting that happened, so I couldn't go. But I was going to go. I think it's because politicians' jobs is about people. Politics is about people, right? Good journalists are about people. If you know how to probably get a source out of a human being. It's about people. And you have to be able to look at President Putin and read him as the way a politician would read him. He is a politician, after all. And it became very clear, I think, again, my experience as security minister, that what we saw in Salisbury was not normal, right? The use of nerve agent on our streets of Britain is not normal. It's not only normal, it came from a state. Yeah. And for a state to authorise the use of a nerve agent in another country, a NATO ally, not of them, but a large NATO ally, is just an extraordinary thing to have done. And that demonstrated to me a very, very significant change in a Russian government stroke Kremlin that thought it was acceptable to do that sort of thing. And that is not the actions of someone who is rational, and it is not the actions of someone who's interested in playing by the rules. And then you just have to look at what he writes. I mean, President Putin's essays, either last year, he did one on 75 years of the Second World War, and you should read that. That is a masterpiece in fiction about how the Soviet Union saved the whole world. I think he actually says the whole world, and that basically it's all our fault Adolf Hitler existed. And it's a masterpiece of more warped fiction. So, we know politicians, right? Politicians that think about legacy are usually fairly dangerous, no matter whether they're elected or not, because it's about, I don't care, I'm off, and but they'll thank me at some stage. And I think President Putin is in legacy mode. They'll thank me in 100 years. Doesn't matter that there's nothing left of Ukraine. I think that is there. Combine that with a belief of what we saw in his speech the day before yesterday. Combine it with a sense of I've been wronged. The world, Russia is owed everything, and we are the great Russia. And you get to a place that is not rational. And as we say, he did what was totally irrational. He invaded Ukraine.
Have you met him?
I sat behind him. I haven't met him. I sat behind him at Chirac's funeral. I was surrounded by the FSB, I think Peskov, his spokesperson, and some big blokes. I wondered if they were there to look at the cathedral as well, but But I've met Shoigu and Gerasimov. I went to Moscow the week before they invaded, and such is.
How do you find that though when you go into these meetings? Because they don't seem to operate by the diplomatic norms. And I mean, okay, in any, particularly if you're a foreign secretary, I suppose that there are certain things you just go through as a matter of course. But the way that Lavrov, effectively humiliated Liz Truss when she was foreign secretary, have you sort of had any of that, which you had to sort of counter?
No, I mean, the one thing I would say of all defence ministries, even the Russian one, is defence ministers are fairly workmanlike. The NATO Council of Defence Ministers is very workmanlike. There's much less sort of posturing and sort of chest, sort of thumping. It's I suppose we all take it very seriously that we hold in our hands responsibility for the men and women that could go to war or could die in the name of this country. Contrary to what sort of people often would suggest from outside, that we're not out there trying to look for wars. We're actually, because we're full of people who know what wars are like, we're trying to avoid wars, right? But we also know there is a role that we have to sometimes play. Ultimately, the role of a defence ministry is to, if called upon, inflict violence on people and infrastructure to deliver a policy outcome that is required or being forced on them. And it is a very, very serious matter. So, when I went to Moscow, it was incredibly professionally done. It was very respectful. There was no fun and games. There was none of that. And in fact, I managed to give a live press conference from the embassy, and Russia Today live streamed the whole thing. They didn't do anything with it. They carried it in full, including my quips at Mr. Lavrov, because I decided I was going to research his treaties and indeed all the commitments he'd signed up to. And this is the thing people shouldn't forget, that on numerous occasions in the last 20 years, Putin or Lavrov have signed up to commitments to respect a nation's sovereignty and their ability to join alliances, including security. So when he gave his speech day before yesterday, and he said, "Who asked us? Who asked Russia?" Well, he was asked, and he signed it, right? I mean, he's got a bizarre memory about what his nation has contributed to do and signed up to. So, no, it was perfectly legitimate meeting. It was straightforward, professional, and every now and then you've got a clue what's going on.
I think one of the other interesting things about the last 7 or 8 months has been the unity of NATO, which, NATO's had a bit of a checkered history, you think of the Trump years, and people began to wonder whether NATO was as important as we've all found it over the decades. Have you been surprised at the unity and the fact that Sweden, Finland are now joining as well? No one could have really ever predicted that.
I think I've been surprised. Yeah, I mean, look, I am in one sense I'm surprised, but I referenced 30-odd visits. I think maintaining coalitions are really important. That you put the work in, right? You have to travel around and see them, and when something happens, you have to do it even more. But I think you just need to get excited about things that matter and not so bothered about others. Of course, different nations move at different speeds. Of course, France, President Macron made some comments about having a different vision for NATO. But so what? I mean, NATO is adapting. The threat changes. We must change with it as we go. What I think was really interesting was Sweden and Finland. I'm old enough to know and remember that the sort of neutrality that Finland and Sweden effectively believe in and wedded to is really central to part of their DNA. And while the wise heads know that when you join the EU, you actually are no longer neutral because there is a mutual sort of defence pact in it. You are no longer purely neutral. It was very important to them. But when they started worrying about Putin, that's a really important talisman. There are some countries like Britain, like Poland, like some of the Baltic states who have very checkered history with Russia, and it's always fairly antagonistic. That's not the case for Sweden and Finland. So when they are worried, when they were genuinely upset by what Putin was doing, but also worried about their own security, I remember saying to the European Commission, you need to listen to that. I mean, this is not the usual suspects, not Britain coming along or whatever. These are countries that are genuinely worry about what's going on, and they know Russia. I often speak to the president of Finland. I've spoken to him quite a few times over the last 3 years. He's the leader in Europe that's spoken to Putin more than anyone else. And people like him matter. His guidance to me and his counsel mattered, and so I would often go and visit them to talk about what's coming next. We offered actually before they chose to go to NATO, because I don't think anyone really thought they were going to. I mean, even about a year ago, I remember having a discussion with some Finnish or Swedish ministers, one of the two, and there was a sort of view that they could, but they didn't think it was necessarily likely in their population. Well, I mean, how short a time has passed before they are signed up and fully prepared to enter NATO, and entirely Putin's doing. He was warned you'll get more NATO. He was warned not to do it. He has driven them into the hands of NATO. NATO doesn't go around sort of recruiting people. It's an open door. He chose.
In a year's time, or slightly less than that, I think Jens Stoltenberg stands down as Secretary General. Is that a job you might fancy? I'm sure you must have been asked this before.
Yeah, I do get asked. Look, I love doing the Defence Secretary job. I genuinely do. I don't know how long the Prime Minister wants me to do it. I mean, if I say the wrong thing in my speech today, that'd be a short job on Tuesday. But I think I think it's just look. It'd be a nice job, but I love this. I want to finish talking about earlier thing about down to the fingertips. If I want to hold the Prime Minister to account on the pledges of defence. Right? I mean, very important to me when it came to the leadership election that people recognise that defence spending is not a discretionary luxury at the bottom of people's priorities. It's for real. The world is very much more unsafer. The world is more unstable. We all worry about our prices and our security of our supply chains. Well, that isn't going to happen on its own. We have to invest in security. We have to invest in keeping our people safe. We are constantly under some form of attack. I mean, as we speak right now, somebody somewhere is trying to launch a cyber attack. Somebody somewhere is trying to influence a country to turn against what our values are. And as we speak right now, somebody is trying to invade a sovereign nation using brutality as its battle-winning ingredient and challenge everything we stand for. So I was determined that whoever became the next leader, the person I would support, would be investing in defence. And Liz Truss has been true to her word. She has said she will invest in defence. And I suppose to reflect on that hollowing out bit, culturally, it's really interesting when you engage with the Treasury. It's always culture when you're doing Treasury, but no one really wants to believe that defence is going to increase its spending. They don't really want it. It's been the sort of it's been the go-to bucket for funding for the last 40 years. Oh, well, where are we going to get some more funding for the latest manifesto commitment or the Department of Health, NHS or whatever? Oh, I would just get some more defence. And, it's interesting in my own department, the culture of doing everything they can to hold on to what they've got is right through the organisation, desperate not to lose more funding because they've had 40 years of it, and 30 odd years, whatever. And that is a sad place where we've got to. You watch.
Managing decline.
It's managed decline in an extent. And, I said publicly that I was serving in 91 when the Options for Change paper came out, and it was right that after, we were up to 4.5%, if not more, of GDP over the Cold War and down to about 3.8, but nevertheless, after investing in the Cold War, that when the Cold War ended, there was a dividend taken. I fully understand that. Problem is, the Treasury went from being a dividend taker to a corporate raider. I mean, it just started to just carried on. And a number of Tory governments, predominantly, actually the last parts of New Labour did the same, got away with effectively announcements based on rather fictional efficiency savings and funding. And if you say to a department, oh yeah, you've got £11 billion or £9 billion of efficiency savings and we're going to add 2 billion, so you've got 11 billion, don't be surprised when they start spending the 11 billion. And then, of course, we got this cycle of big black holes that built up over the years. And I was determined, and I am determined, that as long as I do this job, that we will fix some of the problems. I've talked about Ajax being a troubled program. Now, we will make a decision on Ajax. We are within our contract. They are in their contract. We will play to the contract that we are part of. But if I have to make unpopular decisions, I'll make it, because I don't want to hand over defence to someone who has the usual bow wave of debt that they try and fiddle through. And whatever we deliver, we should have a defence that is perfectly formed, that says what it does on the tin.
We'll come to questions in about 2 minutes. One final question. Had you decided to run for the leadership, many people in this room will think you would have stood a great chance of getting it, and you could have, as Prime Minister, made sure that our defences were safe. Take me through the conflicts that you clearly must have gone through to make that decision not to stand.
Well, first of all, I didn't make the decision to stand. So I have to be honest. You have to really, really want it to be a Prime Minister. I think you have to really want to sacrifice absolutely everything. And I mean in your private and your personal life. I think it carries with it, in reality, a scar that's with you for life. Doesn't mean to say I wasn't tempted. I was conflicted between a deep sense of duty I have to the country I love to try and do the very best for it. But also, I knew that I was in a job I felt fulfilled in, and you know yourself from politics. To be a member of Parliament is amazing. I'm lucky, I thought, to get elected, right? I mean, I never really expected myself to be elected. I fought a Labour marginal seat in 2005, and I won a seat. I thought I was quite lucky to be elected. Then I was lucky to be a minister. So I'm in a job I think people respect me for. I managed to deliver. I thought I saw a chance to get out of one of the leadership candidates some money to put right what I passionately feel, which is a defence to be invested. And therefore, I felt fulfilled. And if I'm just left alone and the pledges are kept, then I think I can hopefully walk off into the sunset when that eventual bus runs you over, which it always will, and feel I've contributed. And making a difference is what all MPs are in it for. And I think we're sometimes rather cruel on MPs. They just do, of all parties, want to contribute. They want to fix problems. Some of them do it well, some do it bad. And to have the chance that I've had, both as security minister and this, I think I'm very lucky. So at this time of life, the idea was no. I mean, do I rule it out? No, I don't rule it out. But will I be here in a few years' time? I don't know either. So I think I just try and deliver that.
Was there any part of you that thought, you know what, I think I'm quite good in this job, but as Prime Minister, not sure I would be? Because a lot of people...
No, I'm an MP. I think every MP thinks they can be a Prime Minister. But I think Liz Truss will be a fantastic, and is going to be a fantastic Prime Minister. So
right, let's open up to questions. So in the middle at the back.
Can I ask, if Putin disappeared tomorrow, would he be replaced by somebody equally as sinister?
Shall I just repeat that? If Putin
Yeah,
were
no,
replaced
yeah.
tomorrow, would he be replaced by someone equally
Look,
sinister?
we all started off being terribly polite in this whole Ukraine thing, saying it's the Kremlin, it's not Russia. Well, it's not broad Russia, but there is a systemic problem in the Russian government. I'm not sure that if Putin decided he would go off to his villa in Sochi, that the person replacing him would be necessarily any different from him. Which is why I think it's really important that Russia understands that what's going on in Ukraine is unacceptable, and that wouldn't it be good if the Russian leader focused on giving his people, inside lavatories, running water, electricity, healthcare systems, education, all the things that we are quite rightly held accountable to in societies around the world. I mean, the lack of culpability in their system for the lot of the Russian people is a scandal. And that's way before Putin, actually. When I spoke to Shoigu about, sanctions, he said, well, we can suffer like no one else. And I said, but I don't want anyone to suffer. And it was like, it didn't compute that someone might actually say, I actually care about the welfare of your people. I don't want Russians to suffer unnecessarily. So I think until that penny drops, I'm not entirely sure. But every president has made its mark on getting people out of conflicts in Russia. Gorbachev effectively got people out of the Soviet Afghanistan. Putin came to power enjoying getting them out of the first Chechen war. And he would demark himself compared to his predecessor by saying, I'm going to stop this and move on. So maybe the next person might make their mark by saying we're getting out of the Ukraine war.
Do you think he's being told the truth? Do you think he actually knows what's happening in Ukraine?
I think he knows some of it. The nature of the Russian armed forces doesn't tell any truth. I mean, the whole system, the whole society, by the looks of things in Russia, the media, there's no truth in any of it. I mean, you only have to watch its media every night or during the week to see that I can't see much truth in much of that. What they tell themselves sometimes is devoid of truth, and often the tension in the system is who's going to tell the truth. And that's hung up off the Soviet Union. I think they will not be out there telling everyone the truth. I think he genuinely believes the low casualty figures. I think he genuinely believed his army was invincible. And he and Shoigu and others believed the Ukrainians would welcome them. And, there we are. Got that wrong.
Right. So.
After the war is over, and hopefully that'll be shorter term and longer term, and borders, hopefully the 1991 border of Ukraine is what exists. How open will NATO be for Ukraine to join NATO, and how quickly?
Well, our policy is for an open door application. Since Ukraine had wished to join, we've had Sweden and Finland come in. And by the way, that hasn't provoked an invasion of Finland or Sweden by Russia. I think I can't speak for 29 other nations, but I think we should be first of all honest that what NATO likes or tries to have is a country without conflict when it comes within its borders. I think we should also stop indulging the NATO. I wrote an article last year about straw man, thrown out by Putin at the NATO bases. Even in his speech on Friday, he mentions NATO in a fleeting comment. In his long essay, his 19-page essay on Ukraine, he mentions in one paragraph NATO. Because what really drives Putin is ethnic nationalism. He knows that until Sweden and Finland are joined, only 6% of his borders have NATO on it. I mean, that's not exactly NATO's coming to get me. It's actually the opposite. He knows that. What he's really obsessed by is the ancient people of Rus and his warped history. So I don't think if we fast forward, let's say, 10 years and we are successful in, it could be hopefully this year, but you never know. You know how long these conflicts go on, that Ukraine is successful in liberating all its sovereign territory and we start to rebuild Ukraine, then we should be open to them joining. But, you know, I can't say when that would be, and you have to move 30 nations at the same speed.
Right. Hand right at the back there. You.
Minister, we seem to be somewhat distracted by what's going on in Ukraine. I mean, there are other areas of the world where we are seeking to project power if necessary. We've got 2 aircraft carriers, one of which has broken down, along with the other 4 or 5 frigates. The Navy seems to be starved of funds. Not only is the one aircraft carrier, which is functional, is sailing around with only half an air wing. When are the F-35Bs, which provide the force that mobile platform projects, when are they going to be delivered? It seems that this is a very expensive and toothless dog that we have sailing around the seas.
Well, if I could deal with your criticism. So first of all, the Queen Elizabeth carrier and the Prince of Wales's break is not to do with funding. Okay, it didn't break down because of funding, right? Well, it was a consortium. It wasn't just BAE that built it. Secondly, we've actually got more pilots than we have. We have more aircraft than we have pilots with F-35Bs. So there's simply no point in me just buying another 20 when we've only got, I think, 20 pilots and we've got 25 F-35Bs. So we need to make sure that we develop the pilot pipeline at the same time as we buy the F-35Bs.
Why hasn't that been done?
What?
Developing the pilot pipeline.
Well, that was because they chose a pilot pipeline construct that involved about 4 different companies in a disjointed sort of PFI structure that we are trying to sort out at this particular moment in time. It was one of my priorities I gave the Chief of the Air Staff when I was first appointed to this job, to fix the pilot pipeline, because we had, 200 plus people who'd passed the aptitude, who were loitering, waiting for the next phase of their pilot training, and that was because instead of getting the target number through the process, we weren't. Now, some of that was poor procurement choices on the type of aircraft they were buying. The other bit was the way it was just a very inefficient construct of sort of buying bits of the process differently. We are getting up to it, but then we get into any also what we call first of class type, is when you move from Tornado to Typhoon, for example, you need instructors. Well, where do you get the instructors from if you've only got Tornadoes? So we've got the pinch point in the F-35 conversion is the number of F-35 instructors we have to take people from basic flight training into piloting. That will fix itself because eventually you'll get enough to go through the process. And in fact, what we did first time around is we bought places on the American course to get our instructors, and we may have to look to do that as well. Then the overall issue about the overall budget, Navy budget, 2 things to that. Look, we need to do some work on availability. The last First Sea Lord, now the current Chief of Defence Staff, remarked and tried to change when he was serving that there was a huge numbers of Navy personnel who were shore-based, vast amounts, something like 50% of the Navy was shore-based, sort of thing, which means our availability was lower. So you can have as many ships as you like, there's not many crews to go around. We need to fix that. So we need to get more people out of headquarters and back into ships. After all, I'm hoping that's what people join the Navy for. So that's one of it. Some of it goes back to my earlier point about leaders of our services being focused on new platforms and not on the mundane. We have not spent the money in the last few decades on ship lifts, on cranes, on dry docks, on ship stores that allow these ships to be mended in a time when they need to be mended to time, so we don't have to run longer submarines or ships. And the reality is when you run these things even longer, they cost a lot of money. The older you run, the older it costs. So we've got to fix some of that, and that means we have to be honest about not pretending we can have 30 new frigates or whatever it is with whatever new money we get. The first thing we're going to do with the new money is invest in the ammo stocks, invest in those rather unglamorous. I'm looking forward to you all coming down to me, launching a crane or a ship lift into the fabric of our defence to make sure we have that equipment. Because there is simply no point me buying lots and lots of more ships if you don't have the crews to man it. And I think that's the key. And the last bit is thinking intelligently about the cycles of replacements. So we know our amphibious assault ships, Albion and Bulwark, are going to come to the end of their time about the end of the decade. Who else in the world is buying those at the same time? And can we all join together to buy 5 or 6 or 4 or whatever we have to do at the same time? That's one of the ways you save money. It's also one of the ways I've discovered you don't have to pay VAT to the Treasury if it's an international consortium. And you laugh about that.
In tax dollars. Shock.
Well, you laugh about that, but when I looked at how the government has claimed in the past, and it goes back to sort of the last few sort of slight cons that have gone on in defence spending, when I look at what contributes to the 2% of GDP of defence spending, this country includes £1.7 billion of VAT. That is, I can't do anything with a VAT receipt. I don't mind them putting in people, defence pensions or intelligence services pensions as part of the established definition of what, because of course you get people for pensions in a sense. But I pay the MOD, the Treasury, approximately £1.7 billion in VAT. And they say, well, that must be contributing to defence spending. So, it's your money. You're getting it back. So I think we need to fix some of those as well.
Right, someone over this side. A hand there, with beard.
Thanks. Can I ask, to what extent diplomatic resolution to the war in Ukraine is being explored, and how likely do you think it is that they could be successful? Because you could forgive those of us that have paid attention to the words of the American president that the White House favours regime change.
I don't agree with that. The White House is not at all in favour of, all the messaging, both from the White House and President Biden, who I've spoken to a few times at NATO, and others, is, look, this is about Ukraine must not lose, right? Ukraine must not lose. We're not in the business of regime change in Russia or anywhere else, and nor is the United States. The consequences of this invasion for President Putin is a matter for President Putin to face. Is there a diplomatic solution to be had? Well, I think the first thing is it is for Ukraine to decide on its next steps. And we in the West should do everything we can to help Ukraine decide from a position of strength, not weakness. I think that's a very important principle to adhere to. I think when you listen to President Putin's speech on Friday, the idea that he currently is in the business of a proper discussion of anything other than I'll take what I want, and when I pause, you will have a nice ceasefire, and then in 8 years' time I'll come back, which is what he already did in 2014, I think is currently unlikely. He's busy ranting that it's the fault of gay people, apparently. Ian is the fault. It's the fault of gay people and Nazis, Ukraine. That's his current thinking. So it'll be a hard push to negotiate with President Putin.
Nazis are gay, we know that.
It's a challenge. But for us, what we should be preoccupied about is making sure that Putin is unsuccessful in his attempts within Ukraine, and that Ukraine is in the position of strength for when it makes its decisions about what it wants to do for the next step. That is its sovereign right. We're doing this to protect the right of sovereign nations to choose. What they choose to do with it is slightly second. And it's the same with Sweden and Finland. The right of those countries to choose their own security destiny is more important than what they choose to do with it, insofar as, whether they join NATO or not. That's exactly what the President of Finland said last January in his early speech.
I just want to follow up on that with what the Ukrainians think of what we're doing to help them, because every time I interview a Ukrainian MP, and they seem to be very keen to be interviewed on UK media, and one of them, Alexei Goncharenko, I'm sure you've met, the MP for Odessa, he's actually here this week. He's going to be speaking at my For the Many podcast event with Penny Mordaunt later. I remember one day when Alicia Cairns had brought 3 female Ukrainian MPs into the studio for an hour to take calls from my listeners. And halfway through that programme, you texted Alicia to tell her that you'd given the green light on some new weapon system that they were going to have. And we didn't do it on air, but she read this out to the 3 MPs, and one of them got out of her chair and literally danced around the studio. How much do you hear about what the Ukrainians are thinking about what we're doing to help them?
They are incredible people and fighters for what they're doing. and they have been a master of the information campaign. I mean, we all can learn a lot of lessons, both militarily and in the strategic communications world. If anyone here is from a public affairs or communications company, I would recommend you hire some Ukrainians when all this is over, because my God, they know how to outwit the Russian trolls and everything else, and they have managed a sort of global campaign. So they are brilliant at that. They're brilliant at being on your program and here, and that's repeated in many other countries around Europe. They're brilliant at, pushing countries who didn't want to go at the pace they wanted. I don't, they're always very kind to me and grateful, but I don't go really looking to find out. I go to look to see what they need and to see what's important for them to be successful in pushing Russia out of Ukraine. And we can't always do everything, but people forget the journey we have been on. I mean, this is extraordinary. Last July, I asked the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson if I could explore lethal aid to Ukraine. Just as you pointed out, it was quite a long journey of people who even thought about it being a horrific idea, or not horrific, maybe it's too strong, but certainly we're like, and eventually we got over the line with those short-range anti-tank weapons, the NLAWs, which are 300 to 400 meter range. No one could say they're anything other than defensive. I mean, you're not going to, fire it across into other nations' borders. And it was specifically a good weapon system. If someone was going to invade your country and you needed to hold your town or hold your trench, perfect. And then you'll remember the rows about Poland and the fighter planes, and did the Americans support it? Now we've got countries like Slovakia sending helicopters and tanks, and Poland sending tanks. You've got America, the United Kingdom, and Germany sending long-range artillery over 80 kilometres, missile ranges, those HIMARS as they're called. And we've even, I think, I have to correct you, but I think we've seen people talking about having sent planes anyhow. I mean, the world is in a very different position, partly because of the way Putin has conducted himself. I remember when I sent in the high-velocity anti-aircraft missile. I mean, if I'd asked for that in September, they would laugh me out of the cabinet or wherever I was at. And I didn't ask that, but wherever, one of those other meetings, I'd have been laughed out of it. I mean, I sent it in because he was butchering people in Bucha. I mean, I sent it in because it was very easy to say he's bombing civilian areas, he's committing war crimes. There has to be a response. And the response was we put in our high-velocity anti-aircraft missiles, which have successfully engaged both helicopters, fast jets and UAVs operated by the Ukrainians. There will be a response for these behaviours, and that's what's happened, and the international community has done exactly that.
There could also be a response the other way, in that we keep being told, well, they could use tactical nuclear weapons. I mean, is that something that is rising up your agenda now?
Well, that sort of assessment is based on the fact that it is no secret that it's Soviet and now Russian doctrine that tactical nuclear weapons are in their doctrine. It's quite odd to talk about tactical nuclear weapons. I mean, it's I would think, rather twisted concept that you could think of a nuclear weapon somehow tactical. And I think when they talk about tactical nuclear weapons, it's really a weapon about 5 times the size of Hiroshima, right? Or maybe 10 times the size of Hiroshima can be viewed as a tactical nuclear weapon. To me, I mean, that's, it's a rather odd definition. But while it is in the doctrine, we think it is highly unlikely he will do it. And I think, and I have no knowledge of this through any special means. I just watched the media of his visit in that group of leaders who all attended recently, with the Chinese and the Indians were there. I think what I could see in what the President of India had said, or what Prime Minister Modi had said, and others, that I think he was given a very clear sense that what is acceptable and unacceptable. And I think he probably knows that doing that would be whatever.
Right, one final question. Do we have a female member of the audience who would like to ask? Good.
I was going to ask about further measures the West can use against Putin. So are we sort of at the stage where sanctions measures are about as far as we can go, or there further ones we can do, maybe visas for Russians, and then do we have more we can do if Putin uses chemical weapons or if it escalates to
Yeah, I mean, there's still a lot of things on the shelf that can be used. You know, you've seen some countries stopping Russian visas and people like that. So there's obviously, well, I think you have to target that at the Secretary of State for Foreign Office and the Prime Minister. I mean, look, it is one of the tools we could use, but you know, the consideration of what?
Have you been arguing for more
We,
measures?
I haven't. No, we haven't. We've just the Foreign Office just announced some new sanctions last week, so they've already stepped some up. But yeah, there's more in the tank, I think, is how I'd say
But
for
people
lots of
wonder
these.
why the Russian embassy is still open here.
Because ours is open in Moscow, and you know, somebody has to communicate, right? You know, I don't have many methods of bringing Shoigu or Gerasimov, and there are certain methods that we have to have to communicate. And what we don't want when it comes to the escalation question, we do not want to find ourselves in a place where we are not able to communicate to the heart
So
of their
you
power.
literally can't just pick up the phone to Shoigu and have a conversation.
I have a method of contacting each other. Yeah, I'm not going to say I have. He's not on my phone. Probably is actually, but you know, if you hear this, so that's always important to have a diplomat. It's always important to have a diplomat. You know, again, our point is this is not about regime change. It's not about trying to get rid of, you know, what the Russian people have to reconcile their Russian government with themselves. It's entirely their issue. We know what we stand for. We offer that, and it's one of the big dilemmas about the visa issue. There are people coming out of Russia who genuinely are trying to leave Russia for all the right reasons. You know, they are opponents. They're being persecuted. You know, if you look at that speech, you know, and so that there is, you know, just saying no, you can't come in is, you know, would not be right. But then there are others who are off to their holiday homes and accidentally forgetting they've just been drafted, and instantly enough they didn't seem to want to run until after the mobilisation came in, and some of those people are probably people you wouldn't really want to come to this country because their motives are all in the wrong place. So I think that a blanket visa thing's a challenge. We should always be a place for people who are fleeing persecution and who, you know, stand and agree with us on the human rights and the values that we hold dear.
Well, Ben, thank you very much. The last, when I interviewed Gavin Williamson when he was Defence Secretary, he was sacked 3 months later. When I interviewed Penny Mordaunt when she was Defence Secretary, she was sacked 3 days later. Good luck.
I think